Don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos. Fantastic Mr. Fox. The three farmers down in the valley, there were 3 farms. The owners of these farms had done well. They were rich men. They were also nasty men. All 3 of them were about as nasty and mean as any men you could meet. Their names were Farmer Boggies, Farmer Bunce, and Farmer Bean. Boggus was a chicken farmer. He kept thousands of chickens. He was enormously fat. This was because he ate 3 boiled chickens smothered with dumplings every day for breakfast, lunch, and supper. Bunce was a duck and goose farmer. He kept thousands of ducks and geese. He was a kind of pot-bellied dwarf. He was so short, his chin would have been underwater in the shallow end of any swimming pool in the world. His food was donuts and goose livers. He mashed the livers into a disgusting paste and then stuffed the paste into the donuts. This diet gave him a tummy ache and a beastly temper. Mr. Fox, on a 1111, above the valley there was a wood. In the wood there was a huge tree. Under the tree there was a hole. In the hole lived Mr. Fox and Mrs. Fox and their 4 small foxes. Every evening, as soon as it got dark, Mr. Fox would say to Mrs. Fox, "Well, my darling, what shall it be this time? A plump chicken from Boggus? A duck? Or a goose from Bunce? Or a nice turkey from Bean?" And when Mrs. Fox had told him what she wanted, Mr. Fox would creep down into the valley in the darkness of the night and help himself. Boggus and Bunce and Bean knew very well what was going on, and it made them wild with rage. They were not men who liked to give anything away. Less still did they like anything to be stolen from them. So every night each of them would take his shotgun and hide in a dark place somewhere on his own farm, hoping to catch the robber. But Mr. Fox was too clever for them. He always approached a farm with the wind blowing in his face, and this meant that if any man were lurking in the shadows ahead, the wind would carry the smell of that man to Mr. Fox's nose from far away. Thus, if Mr. Boggus was hiding behind his chicken house number 1, Mr. Fox would smell him out from 50 yards off and quickly change direction, heading for chicken house number 4 at the other end of the farm. "I'd like to rip his guts out," said Bunce. "He must be killed," cried Bean. "But how?" said Boggus. "How on earth can we catch the blighter?" Bean picked his nose delicately with a long finger. "I have a plan," he said. "You've never had a decent plan yet," said Bunce. "Shut up and listen," said Bean. "Tomorrow night we will all hide just outside the hole where the fox lives. We will wait there until he comes out. Then, bang, 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 bang." "Very clever," said Bunce. "But first we shall have to find the hole." "My dear Bunce, I've already found it," said the crafty Bean. "It's up in the wood on the hill. It's under a huge tree." The shooting. "Well, my darling," said Mr. Fox, "what shall it be tonight?" "I think we'll have duck tonight," said Mrs. Fox. "Bring us 2 fat ducks, if you please. One for you and me, and one for the children." "Ducks it shall be," said Mr. Fox. "Bunce is best." "Now do be careful," said Mrs. Fox. "My darling," said Mr. Fox, "I can smell those goons a mile away. I can even smell one from the other. Boggus gives off a filthy stink of rotten chicken skins. Bunce reeks of goose livers, and as for Bean, the fumes of apple cider hang around him like poisonous gases." "Yes, but just don't get careless," said Mrs. Fox. "You know they'll be waiting for you, all 3 of them." "Don't you worry about me," said Mr. Fox. "I'll see you later." But Mr. Fox would not have been quite so cocky had he known exactly where the 3 farmers were waiting at that moment. They were just outside the entrance to the hole, each one crouching behind a tree with his gun loaded. And what is more, they had chosen their positions very carefully, making sure that the wind was not blowing from them towards the fox's hole. In fact, it was blowing in the opposite direction. There was no chance of them being smelled out. Mr. Fox crept up the dark tunnel to the mouth of his hole. He poked his long, handsome face out into the night air and sniffed once. He moved an inch or 2 forward and stopped. He sniffed again. He was always especially careful when coming out from his hole. He inched forward a little more. The front half of his body was now in the open. His black nose twitched from side to side, sniffing and sniffing for the scent of danger. He found none, and he was just about to go trotting forward into the wood when he heard or thought he heard a tiny noise, a soft rustling sound, as though someone had moved a foot ever so gently through a patch of dry leaves. Mr. Fox flattened his body against the ground and lay very still, his ears pricked. He waited a long time, but he heard nothing more. It must have been a field mouse, he told himself, or some other small animal. He crept a little further out of the hole, then further still. He was almost right out in the open now. He took a last careful look around. The wood was murky and very still. Somewhere in the sky, the moon was shining. Just then, his sharp night eyes caught a glint of something bright behind a tree not far away. It was a small silver speck of moonlight shining on a polished surface. Mr. Fox lay still, watching it. What on earth was it? Now it was moving. It was coming up and up. Great heavens! It was the barrel of a gun. Quick as a whip, Mr. Fox jumped back into his hole, and at that same instant the entire wood seemed to explode around him. Bang, 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 bang! The smoke from the three guns floated upward in the night air. Boggis and Bunsen Bean came out from behind their trees and walked towards the hole. "Did we get him?" said Bean. One of them shone a flashlight on the hole, and there on the ground, in the circle of light, half in and half out of the hole, lay the poor, tattered, blood-stained remains of a fox's tail. Bean picked it up. "We got the tail, but we missed the fox," he said, tossing the thing away. "Dang and blast," said Boggis. "We shot too late. We should have let fly the moment he poked his head out." "He won't be poking it out again in a hurry," Bunce said. Bean pulled a flask from his pocket and took a swig of cider. Then he said, "It'll take 3 days at least before he gets hungry enough to come out again. I'm not sitting around here waiting for that. Let's dig him out." "Ah," said Boggis. "Now you're talking sense. We can dig him out in a couple of hours. We know he's there." "I reckon there's a whole family of them down that hole," Bunce said. "Then we'll have the lot," said Bean. "Get the shovels." The terrible shovels. Down the hole, Mrs. Fox was tenderly licking the stump of Mr. Fox's tail to stop the bleeding. "It was the finest tail for miles around," she said between licks. "It hurts," said Mr. Fox. "I know it does, sweetheart, but it'll soon get better." "And it will soon grow again, Dad," said one of the small foxes. "It will never grow again," said Mr. Fox. "I shall be tailless for the rest of my life." He looked very glum. There was no food for the foxes that night, and soon the children dozed off. Then Mrs. Fox dozed off. But Mr. Fox couldn't sleep because of the pain in the stump of his tail. "Well," he thought, "I suppose I'm lucky to be alive at all. And now they've found our hole. We're going to have to move out as soon as possible. We'll never get any peace if we—" What was that? He turned his head sharply and listened. The noise he heard now was the most frightening noise a fox can ever hear. The scrape, scrape, scraping of shovels digging into the soil. "Wake up!" he shouted. "They're digging us out!" Mrs. Fox was wide awake in 1 second. She sat up, quivering all over. "Are you sure that's it?" she whispered. "I'm positive. Listen." "They'll kill my children," cried Mrs. Fox. "Never," said Mr. Fox. "But darling, they will," sobbed Mrs. Fox. "You know they will." Scrunch, scrunch, scrunch went the shovels above their heads. Small stones and bits of earth began falling from the roof of the tunnel. "How will they kill us, Mummy?" asked one of the small foxes. His round black eyes were huge with fright. "Will there, he dogs," he said. Mrs. Fox began to cry. She gathered her 4 children close to her and held them tight. Suddenly there was an especially loud crunch above their heads, and the sharp end of a shovel came right through the ceiling. The sight of this awful thing seemed to have an electric effect upon Mr. Fox. He jumped up and shouted, "I've got it! Come on! There's not a moment to lose. Why didn't I think of it before?" "Think of what, Dad?" "A fox can dig quicker than a man," shouted Mr. Fox, beginning to dig. "Nobody in the world can dig as quick as a fox." The soil began to fly out furiously behind Mr. Fox as he started to dig for dear life with his front feet. Mrs. Fox ran forward to help him. So did the 4 children. "Go downwards," ordered Mr. Fox. "We've got to go deep as we possibly can." The tunnel began to grow longer and longer. It sloped steeply downward. Deeper and deeper below the surface of the ground it went. The mother and the father and all 4 of the children were digging together. Their front legs were moving so fast you couldn't see them, and gradually the scrunching and scraping of the shovels became fainter and fainter. After about an hour, Mr. Fox stopped digging. "Hold it," he said. They all stopped. They turned and looked back up the long tunnel they had just dug. All was quiet. "Phew," said Mr. Fox. "I think we've done it. They'll never get as deep as this. Well done, everyone." They all sat down, panting for breath, and Mrs. Fox said to her children, "I should like you to know that if it wasn't for your father, we should all be dead by now. Your father is a fantastic fox." Mr. Fox looked at his wife, and she smiled. He loved her more than ever when she said things like that. The terrible tractors. As the sun rose the next morning, Boggis and Bunsen Bean were still digging. They had dug a hole so deep you could have put a house into it. But they had not yet come to the end of the fox's tunnel. They were all very tired and cross. "Dang and blast," said Bogus. "Whose rotten idea was this?" "Bean's idea," said Bunce. Bogus and Bunce both stared at Bean. Bean took another swig of cider, then put the flask back into his pocket without offering it to the others. "Listen," he said angrily, "I want that fox. I'm going to get that fox. I'm not giving in till I've strung him up over my front porch, dead as a dumpling." "We can't get him by digging, that's for sure," said the fat Bogus. "I've had enough of digging." Bunce, the little pot-bellied dwarf, looked up at Bean and said, "Have you got any more stupid ideas then?" "What?" said Bean. "I can't hear you." Bean never took a bath. He never even washed. As a result, his ear holes were clogged with all kinds of muck and wax and bits of chewing gum and dead flies and stuff like that. This made him deaf. "Speak louder," he said to Bunce, and Bunce shouted back, "Got any more stupid ideas?" Bean rubbed the back of his neck with a dirty finger. He had a boil coming there, and it itched. "What we need on this job," he said, "is machines. Mechanical shovels. We'll have 'em out in 5 minutes with mechanical shovels." This was a pretty good idea, and the other two had to admit it. "All right then," Bean said, taking charge. "Bogus, you stay here and see the fox doesn't escape. Bunce and I will go and fetch our machinery. If he tries to get out, shoot him quick." The long, thin Bean walked away. The tiny Bunce trotted after him. The fat Bogus stayed where he was with his gun pointing at the foxhole. Soon 2 enormous caterpillar tractors with mechanical shovels on their front ends came clanking into the wood. Bean was driving one, Bunce the other. The machines were both black. They were murderous, brutal-looking monsters. "Here we go, then," shouted Bean. "Death to the fox," shouted Bunce. The machines went to work, biting huge mouthfuls of soil out of the hill. The big tree under which Mr. Fox had dug his hole in the first place was toppled like a matchstick. On all sides, rocks were sent flying and trees were falling, and the noise was deafening. Down in the tunnel, the foxes crouched, listening to the terrible clanging and banging overhead. "What's happening, Dad?" cried the small foxes. "What are they doing?" Mr. Fox didn't know what was happening or what they were doing. "It's an earthquake!" cried Mrs. Fox. "Look," said one of the small foxes. "Our tunnel's got shorter. I can see daylight." They all looked round, and yes, the mouth of the tunnel was only a few feet away from them now, and in the circle of daylight beyond, they could see the 2 huge black tractors almost on top of them. "Tractors!" shouted Mr. Fox. "And mechanical shovels! Dig for your lives! Dig! Dig! Dig!" The race now, there began a desperate race, the machines against the foxes. In the beginning, the hill looked like this. After about an hour, as the machines bit away more and more soil from the hilltop, it looked like this. Sometimes the foxes would gain a little ground, and the clanking noises would grow fainter, and Mr. Fox would say, "We're going to make it, I'm sure we are." But then, a few moments later, the machines would come back at them, and the crunch of the mighty shovels would get louder and louder. Once the foxes actually saw the sharp metal edge of one of the shovels as it scraped up the earth just behind them. "Keep going, my darlings," panted Mr. Fox. "Don't give up." "Keep going," the fat Bogus shouted to Bunce and Bean. "We'll get him any moment now." "Have you caught sight of him yet?" Bean called back. "Not yet," shouted Bogus. "But I think you're close." "I'll pick him up with my bucket," shouted Bunce. "I'll chop him to pieces." But by lunchtime, the Ma VV Chinese were still at it, and so were the poor foxes. The hill now looked like this. The farmers didn't stop for lunch. They were too keen to finish the job. "Hey there, Mr. Fox," yelled Bunce, leaning out of his tractor. "We're coming to get you now." "You've had your last chicken," yelled Bogus. "You'll never come prowling around my farm again." A sort of madness had taken hold of the 3 men. The tall, skinny Bean and dwarfish, pot-bellied Bunce were driving their machines like maniacs, racing the motors and making the shovels dig at a terrific speed. The fat Bogus was hopping about like a dervish and shouting, "Faster! Faster!" By 5 o'clock in the afternoon, this is what had happened to the hill. The hole the machines had dug was like the crater of a volcano. It was such an extraordinary sight that crowds of people came rushing out from the surrounding villages to have a look. They stood on the edge of the crater and stared down at Bogus and Bunce and Bean. "Hey there, Bogus. What's going on?" "We're after a fox." "You must be mad." The people jeered and laughed, but this only made the 3 farmers more furious and more obstinate and more determined than ever not to give up until they had caught the fox. "We'll never let him go." At 6 o'clock in the evening, Bean switched off the motor of his tractor and climbed down from the driver's seat. Bunce did the same. Both men had had enough. They were tired and stiff from driving the tractors all day. They were also hungry. Slowly they walked over to the small fox's hole in the bottom of the huge crater. Bean's face was purple with rage. Bunce was cursing the fox with dirty words that cannot be printed. Boggis came waddling up. "Dang and blast that filthy, stinking fox," he said. "What the heck do we do now?" "I'll tell you what we don't do," Bean said. "We don't let him go." "We'll never let him go," Bunce declared. "Never, never, never," cried Boggis. "Did you hear that, Mr. Fox?" yelled Bean, bending low and shouting down the hole. "It's not over yet, Mr. Fox. We're not going home till we've strung you up dead as a dingbat." Whereupon the three men all shook hands with one another and swore a solemn oath that they would not go back to their farms until the fox was caught. "What's the next move?" asked Bunce, the pot-bellied dwarf. "We're sending you down the hole to fetch him up," said Bean. "Down you go, you miserable midget." "Not me!" screamed Bunce, running away. Bean made a sickly smile. When he smiled, you saw his scarlet gums. You saw more gums than teeth. "Then there's only one thing to do," he said. "We starve him out. We camp here day and night watching the hole. He'll come out in the end. He'll have to." So Boggis and Bunce and Bean sent messages down to their farms asking for tents, sleeping bags, and supper. The foxes began to starve that evening. 3 tents were put up in the crater on the hill, one for Boggis, one for Bunce, and one for Bean. The tents surrounded Mr. Fox's hole, and the 3 farmers sat outside their tents eating their supper. Boggis had 3 boiled chickens smothered in dumplings. Bunce had 6 donuts filled with disgusting goose liver paste, and Bean had 2 gallons of cider. All 3 of them kept their guns beside them. Boggis picked up a steaming chicken and held it close to the fox's hole. "Can you smell this, Mr. Fox?" he shouted. "Lovely tender chicken. Why don't you come up and get it?" The rich scent of chicken wafted down the tunnel to where the foxes were crouching. "Oh, Dad," said one of the small foxes, "couldn't we just sneak up and snatch it out of his hand?" "Don't you dare," said Mrs. Fox. "That's just what they want you to do." "But we're so hungry," they cried. "How long will it be till we get something to eat?" Their mother didn't answer them, nor did their father. There was no answer to give. As darkness fell, Bunce and Bean switched on the powerful headlamps of the 2 tractors and shone them onto the hole. "Now," said Bean, "we'll take it in turn to keep watch. 1 watches while 2 sleep, and so on all through the night." Boggis said, "What if the fox digs a hole right through the hill and conies out on the other side?" "You didn't think of that one, did you?" "Of course I did," said Bean, pretending he had. "Go on then. Tell us the answer," said Boggis. Bean picked something small and black out of his ear and flicked it away. "How many men have you got working on your farm?" he asked. 35, Boggis said. "I've got 36, Bunce said. "And I've got 37, Bean said. "That makes 108 men altogether. We must order them to surround the hill. Each man will have a gun and a flashlight. There will be no escape then for Mr. Fox." So the order went down to the farms, and that night 108 men formed a tight ring around the bottom of the hill. They were armed with sticks and guns and hatchets and pistols and all sorts of other horrible weapons. This made it quite impossible for a fox, or indeed for any other animal, to escape from the hill. The next day, the watching and waiting went on. Boggis and Bunce and Bean sat upon small stools, staring at the fox's hole. They didn't talk much. They just sat there with their guns on their laps. Every so often, Mr. Fox would creep a little closer towards the mouth of the tunnel and take a sniff. Then he would creep back again and say, "They're still there." "Are you quite sure?" Mrs. Fox would ask. "Positive," said Mr. Fox. "I can smell that man Bean a mile away. He stinks." Met Fox has a plan for 3 days and 3 nights. This waiting game went on. "How long can a fox go without food or water?" Boggis asked on the 3rd day. "Not much longer now," Bean told him. "He'll make a run for it soon. He'll have to." Bean was right. Down in the tunnel, the foxes were slowly but surely starving to death. "If only we could have just a tiny sip of water," said one of the small foxes. "Oh, Dad, can't you do something? Couldn't we make a dash for it, Dad? We'd have a little bit of a chance, wouldn't we?" "No chance at all," snapped Mrs. Fox. "I refuse to let you go up there and face those guns. I'd sooner you stay down here and die in peace." Mr. Fox had not spoken for a long time. He had been sitting quite still, his eyes closed, not even hearing what the others were saying. Mrs. Fox knew that he was trying desperately to think of a way out, and now, as she looked at him, she saw him stir himself and get slowly to his feet. He looked back at his wife. There was a little spark of excitement dancing in his eyes. "What is it, darling?" said Mrs. Fox quickly. "I've just had a bit of an idea," Mr. Fox said carefully. "What?" they cried. "Oh, Dad, what is it?" "Come on," said Mrs. Fox. "Tell us quickly." "Well, Dot," said Mr. Fox. Then he stopped and sighed and sadly shook his head. He sat down again. "It's no good," he said. "It won't work after all." "Why not, Dad?" "Because it means more digging, and we aren't any of us strong enough for that after 3 days and nights without food." "Yes, we are, Dad," cried the small foxes, jumping up and running to their father. "We can do it. You see if we can't. So can you." Mr. Fox looked at the 4 small foxes, and he smiled. "What fine children I have," he thought. "They are starving to death, and they haven't had a drink for 3 days, but they are still undefeated. I must not let them down." I suppose we could give it a try," he said. "Let's go, Dad. Tell us what you want us to do." Slowly, Mrs. Fox got to her feet. She was suffering more than any of them from the lack of food and water. She was very weak. "I am so sorry," she said. "Hut, I don't think I am going to be much help." "You stay right where you are, my darling," said Mr. Fox. "We can handle this by ourselves." Boggis's Chicken House Number 1. "This time we must go in a very special direction," said Mr. Fox, pointing sideways and downward. So he and his 4 children started to dig once again. The work went much more slowly now, yet they kept at it with great courage, and little by little the tunnel began to grow. "Dad, I wish you would tell us where we are going," said one of the children. "I dare not do that," said Mr. Fox, "because this place I am hoping to get to is so marvelous that if I described it to you now, you would go crazy with excitement. And then, if we failed to get there, which is very possible, you would die of disappointment. I don't want to raise your hopes too much, my darlings." For a long, long time they kept on digging. For how long they did not know, because there were no clays and no nights down there in the murky tunnel. But at last, Mr. Fox gave the order to stop. "I think," he said, "we had better take a peep upstairs now and see where we are. I know where I want to be, but I can't possibly be sure we're anywhere near it." Slowly, wearily, the foxes began to slope the tunnel up towards the surface. Up and up it went, until suddenly they came to something hard above their heads, and they couldn't go up any further. Mr. Fox reached up to examine this hard thing. "It's wood," he whispered. "Wooden planks." "What does that mean, Dad?" "It means, unless I am very much mistaken, that we are right underneath somebody's house," whispered Mr. Fox. "Be very quiet now while I take a peek." Carefully, Mr. Fox began pushing up one of the floorboards. The board creaked most terribly, and they all ducked down, waiting for something awful to happen. Nothing did. So Mr. Fox pushed up a second board, and then, very, very cautiously, he poked his head up through the gap. He let out a shriek of excitement.